Hi, my name is Greg Canty, and I'd like to welcome you to the Win Happy podcast. I love chatting to people from all walks of life about their lives and their careers, about the choices they make along the way to pursue their happiness, and what winning actually means to them. I hope you enjoy these conversations as much as I do. Thanks for listening. On today's podcast, I chatted with Cork genealogist David Ryan, who opened up my eyes to a profession I knew nothing about. What exactly does a genealogist do? Who employs them? Why and when? David explained to me the process that he normally follows and the interesting people that he ends up doing the work for, and some of the unusual stories that he uncovers, including one poor man who was killed in Pater Street by a bull who had escaped. As well as providing practical tips about investigating your own family tree, he also spoke about the many online ancestry services that use DNA testing as part of their process, and if these are to be trusted. Let's hear from David. David Ryan, a huge welcome to the Win Happy podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you, Greg. Lovely to be here.
And lovely to meet you. And we've been back and forthing online, and Twitter in particular, I guess. Out of curiosity, I was thinking, who is this person that I'm back and forthing with? Then, of course, you do the simple thing, have a look at your profile. Yeah. And I did a Mr. Google on you. I thought, oh my God, this guy, besides the two of us giving out about Donald Trump the whole time, I thought, he's a very interesting man with a very interesting career. So I can honestly say, you're the very first genealogist that I have ever met.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so there's a first.
There are a few of us out there, just not always as not everyone kind of does it professionally. Some might just be enthusiasts who focus on kind of their own family tree and maybe do a bit of stuff into locality. And then you have those of us who decide, take a chance and try and make a living out of it.
So during the course of our conversation, what I'd like to do is get to know you a little bit, your background, where you came from and all that kind of thing, and how in the name of God you got interested in this whole area, which is very, very interesting. But like that, you're the first ever person in that profession that I've ever met. So obviously 1,000 people haven't signed up for the career that you've pursued. So can you tell me about your early life and your career, your mum and dad, where you grew up, all that kind of thing?
Yeah, I grew up mainly in Cork. My first few years were spent, in Glanworth, just outside of Fermoy. Then we were in Kilkenny for a few years, and then we ended up back in Cork in Glanmire, where I still am, over 30-something years later. And so, I guess I always had an interest in history growing up.
What's your mum and dad do?
My mom used to work in civil service and foreign affairs, but she gave that up after my younger brother was born. My dad used to be in the fire service. He was actually the chief fire officer in Cork City.
That's
up until his retirement a few years back.
Lots of interesting stories from him, I'm sure.
Oh, plenty. But I guess I always grew up with, both my parents have an interest in history. Anytime we'd visit relatives, my dad's from Ballypreen in South Tipperary. My mom's from Araglin, which is just kind of straddles the Cork, Tipperary and Waterford border. So there'd always be lots of local history whenever I'd be visiting relatives. And then kind of as I always enjoyed learning history in school, but of course that was always on the broad sweep of history. And really when I got older and would be coming in and out of the city myself more often, I'd start noticing all of these various signs and plaques that would be up. Historic sites, or also such a person was born here. And that kind of led me to pursue history as one of my subjects in university in UCC.
When it comes to history and how you might be attracted to it, like I think my own version of it, sadly, from school and all that kind of thing was, oh my God, a lot of this is just so boring. And was that a failing of teachers to make it relevant and spark your interest? And was that as much about, the mechanism of delivery of that subject to you? Or is that just a failing in Craig?
No, I think it's I'm not going to say anything negative about history just because I've had some great history teachers myself, and I know a few friends who've gone into that. But I think part of it was just it's the nature of the curriculum that they have there's such a broad sweep to cover in what essentially 12 years of school if you decide to keep it on for the leaving cert. And so of course there will probably be a focus more on what are kind of seen as the essentials. Like in primary school you do kind of learn the basics of Irish history. Then junior cert you do a lot more on, I guess, the distant past. And then by the time you get to leaving cert, you're able to specialise a bit more when it comes to, what topic you decide to take on for your special project. So I think part of it is just, a lot of people do feel that way, that they just don't feel that, when they're learning maybe about Cromwell or about the various world wars, that they don't feel that connection. And then maybe it's only when we can really start to do maybe the local history, they can say, okay, now I'm actually seeing the relevance.
Can I give you an example? I'm on a plane. We're coming back from Berlin. Myself and Dee, we were over there for a weekend. It's all the Celtic Tiger days. We were over there with pals on a weekend. Way too much to drink and up late and all that kind of thing. But we did go to the Holocaust memorial there, which is really, really interesting and sobering, obviously. And we're on the plane on the way back, and like that now, they're handing out some free newspapers at a time when some of the airlines did things like that.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm reading a review of a book called The Scarlet Pimpernel of the Vatican. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. We were doing a lot of work in Kerry at the time.
Yeah.
And they were talking about this Kerry priest, Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty. And I thought initially this must have been a piece of fiction. The stories were a bit kind of wild, and, that there was this cat and mouse game between him and Kepler. And then I realized this is a true story. And we actually have a genuine Irish World War II hero who was born in Cork, living in Kerry or growing up in Kerry, who had to save 6,500 people during World War II. And at this point now, I'm starting to get angry. And I'm thinking, why in the name of God do I not know this? And Dee, my other half, she's sitting alongside me and I'm nudging her in the plane, and she's obviously flicking through her own magazine or God knows what she was doing. I said, you're from Kerry. Have you heard of this guy? She said, no. We haven't heard of Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty. We were doing a lot of work in Kerry at the time and having conversations down there with some people that we knew. And I'm asking the question, have you heard of this guy? And someone said, oh, yeah. We think there's a memorial to him in the Killarney National Park. There was a bunch of trees that were planted at some point in time. And now I'm really getting angry, thinking, why do we not know this? That's a long way of me coming around to the point that I'm making, is that, is there an onus on teachers? It does sound like I'm giving out to teachers, but to spark the interest of the students who were sitting in front of you in those classes. And I swear to God, for me, and obviously primary school all the way up through secondary school, I was obviously hugely interested in that story, the way it was presented to me in a book. but the rest is just a blur. In your case, it wasn't a blur. What's the difference between you and me? Was it a teacher? Was it a parent or someone that sparked
It
your
could have been a
interest?
combination of those. Because, like I was, as I was looking, I ended up going to secondary school out in Carricknavar because, at the time we'd been waiting years on a secondary school here in Glanmire. And like a lot of things in Ireland, it was promised and, next year it'll be there now. And then, I think I was, in junior cert by the time the long promised secondary school in Glanmire finally opened. So like, I was fortunate, Carricknavar, they were very interested in history. And because the principal at the time had been a history teacher himself. The history teacher I had for my leaving cert years went on to eventually become principal of the school himself. I think he only retired, this year or something like that. So maybe it was, the school itself. But I said, both my parents were very interested in history. And I remember at one point visiting my paternal grandparents in Ballypreen, and they had one of these things you get printed off that you can buy in any of these heraldry shops, or kind of any tourist shops now about like the history of the Ryan surname. I was all about this whole thing that they'd been kings of Tipperary at one point and all this. I was like, we were descended from royalty. And then, of course, years later, I, studied medieval Irish history and realized, okay, being king of a certain part of Ireland wasn't necessarily as impressive as, say, being, the king of England or the king of France.
Not quite.
Not quite. But still, I guess, I was just brought up in that environment. And, there were certain periods that I just didn't have that much interest in. Like, when I was in school, I wasn't that interested in the world wars. Because it seemed to always be about, these big battles, and sure, did it really change anything? And it wasn't until years later that when, I guess, World War I started to filter into the public consciousness in Ireland more, and I got to know people like the local historian Jerry White and members of the Cork Branch Western Front Association. And they do a fantastic, they focus on the individuals. And I realised just how big an impact the First World War had on Cork in particular. Once you start to see it as, these individual stories, and, you can find something to connect it to. And I even discovered that I had a great-granduncle on my mother's side who had served in the war. Again, he's fine. But again, it wasn't spoken about because that side of the family tended to be kind of, very Irish Republican. So obviously, a relative who had been part of the British Army didn't fit with the narrative, wasn't really spoken about. I guess that was part of what attracted me to genealogy then, I guess, because, how many of these other hidden stories are out there that we overlook or we haven't thought about.
Yeah. There's a parallel to that Hugh O'Flaherty's story because he was actually helping a lot of British. And of course, that's like, yellow card. You can't be helping that gang. And this is in the 40s, obviously, after World War II. So everything is very raw still at that stage and would continue to be. So I think maybe there was a deliberate reason why his fantastic deeds weren't celebrated in that particular way. And we actually know that to be the case from some of the documentation about it. Some people thought he was doing the wrong thing, quite specifically and officially in many respects. So that's quite interesting. So you were on a historian path.
Yeah.
I presume that continued then into college and stuff, did it?
It did, yes. I did history as part of my BA in college at UCC. I went on to do a master's in medieval history. And after, I guess, I felt that a bit of a sort of, I wanted to continue doing something in history, but I wasn't necessarily keen at the time of just following an academic path. So I said, yeah, okay, maybe I'll try and get something local. So I ended up working in a few, local history roles in the city. And around the time that the Triskel Arts Centre had just undergone its big redevelopment, they had taken over the management of the Christchurch building next to them. And they were looking for someone who could give tours and do a bit more research into the history of the building. Because they really did want to emphasize the historical role of the church, as well as it just being a nice venue for their cinema and their concerts. And every so often, because the church only closed in the late 70s, so there were still people in the city who had a living memory of it being a functioning Anglican church, and who would have been former parishioners. And every so often, I get people who would reach out looking for information on their family who might have been married there, or might have been baptized, or maybe were buried in the crypt or something like that. And at first, I just forward the queries on to anyone else I thought who might know something more. But gradually I think, well, why shouldn't I start learning how to do some of that research myself? You already have the background when it comes to history, and fortunately, it was at a time when you had a lot of stuff was suddenly becoming available online for free. Like the National Archives of Ireland uploaded the 1901-1911 census records. A lot of church records were becoming available. The government set up the Irish genealogy.ie website. So it was suddenly becoming easier to do it. And I got to know those involved with Cork Genealogical Society, some of the other local historical societies. I got to know academic in UCC, Dr. David Butler, who decided he was going to start teaching a 2-year evening course diploma in genealogy. So I said, I'll sign up for that. And from there, I got to know a lot of other people already working as professionals. And some of them offered advice, acted as mentors, and would occasionally say, look, if you're looking to get onto this, if we do have a query for Cork, we'll send on, a few people to you. And as it still took me time to kind of build up the confidence, really, kind of in doing the research, because just knowing how to do it isn't necessarily having to say, having the faith in what you're doing. I'm sure, it's the same with any profession, because I'm sure, when you started in, with pure, you don't just normally, magically wake up one day and say, you know what, I'm an expert in this, I know what I'm doing. It takes you time sort of, to build that confidence.
Yeah, so with the help of understanding the process and a bit of guidance from some of these mentors and maybe fellow genealogists, you were in business and you became Mr. Cork Genealogy.
Yeah, certainly. And I was in my early 30s at the time, and most other genealogists back then typically tended to be older. It was something that sort of people would take up as sort of a bit of a hobby when they retired, and then might decide to actually make a living. There weren't that many other young people, in a relative sense, doing it. So I think maybe that might have worked in my favor too.
Who ends up requesting this information, and what's the typical process?
It can vary. I mean, a lot of the queries I get would typically be Americans, or maybe someone living in the UK, and they've yes, maybe they're getting older. They've heard a lot of family stories, and it's probably something they've been thinking of doing for it. And maybe they've probably done a bit of it already. Like they've messed around on Ancestry or some of the other sites. Maybe they've decided to take one of the home DNA tests or something like that. And I guess they're curious, so they'll normally what happens. I'll get an email from someone, and they'll say, "Look, we have a family story of our family coming from Cork. This was the surname. Can you help me?" And one thing I learned, like when I first started, I would have just jumped straight into it. I said, "Yeah, I'm the man for this. I'll definitely be able to help." But now I tend to be more okay. Well, what information do you have already? What specifically are you looking to find out? So I'll usually, before I actually officially agree to anything, I'll say, okay, I need to look at what you already have. Because there might be situations where they only have a very vague idea of where the ancestors came from. It might just be, well, we have a family story, they came from Cork. And, you look at the information they have and say, well, this is looking more likely that maybe they came from somewhere like Belfast or Derry. And, I don't see any Cork connection here, or they may not even be Irish. In which case, you say to them, well, look, I think you probably need to do more research on your end to try and confirm where they came from. And if it does look like there is a definite Cork connection, I'd be happy to take it on. Or there may be a situation where, like I get a few people who contact me and say, oh, I've gotten back to 1800 research in my, so far, can you go back? And in those situations, and you say to them, well, congratulations, you've gotten back further than most of us can. And there really isn't, unless your family came from means and were sort of, I guess, like landlords or had some sort of title where there'll be, some sort of pedigree surviving. There isn't that much that I could do. But a lot of the time then, once I've concluded that, okay, there is something here that is working, I'll usually outline the process with them and say to them, okay, this is how I'm going to proceed. This is how long I think it will take. And this is, the projected cost. But if I discover that I'm going to have to head up to Dublin and look up some records in the National Archives or request land records or something like that, or order a bunch of birth certs or something like that, then it may end up costing you more.
Yeah, so this is an awful lot more than hitting Mr. Google and being clever as to where you can search.
It is. And I mean, like in Ireland, we are lucky that the National Archives have put the surviving census records online for free. They'll be putting the 1926 census online for free next April. You can, we have the Irish genealogy.ie website, which has quite a lot of free material out there. And there's also, our local archives and libraries also do a fantastic job in putting material up online.
And typically people want to know, it's probably building family trees and where did everyone come from, and does it go as far as what do they do? Is that what they're trying to get at? Yeah, that would be
part of it, because at least usually people's professions will be listed on their marriage and death records, and of course in the census too. And occasionally, a slightly unusual one will come up, so they'll be kind of curious, okay, what did this job involve, or where might they have worked? And that's where you can kind of start diving into the local records, like some of the various trade directories that Cork City Libraries have made available online. And you can say, okay, as say they worked as a carpenter, well, chances are the people tended not to travel that far. So, they probably worked somewhere local.
Yeah, that was all about logistics as much as anything, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. So I think that's something that will trip people up, especially Americans who are used to being able to cover vast distances in a relatively short space of time. So they'll sometimes assume that because Ireland is a small country, that, someone could have gotten from Cork to Dublin and back again in no time at all.
Yeah.
And they explain, unless you had means, you most likely wouldn't have gone further than the next big market town on a regular basis. Even say like someone living in, someone out in West Cork, then in Crookhaven, they may never have set foot in Cork City in their lifetime because simply they wouldn't have had any need.
It's interesting. I was the general manager of a company called DC's. As a Cork one, you probably know, but remember DC's Orange and all that kind of thing? So we had a manufacturing plant in Clonakilty, and there was a local museum there, and I discovered that there was a Canty back in the late 1800s, I think. I might have my dates wrong now. Who was the managing director of the company at that stage. And Canty is a name that would pop up a little bit in kind of West Cork and stuff. Even though, to the best of my knowledge, our particular family would have been kind of more North Cork. Yeah, that was it. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if there's any connection to that. And I'm sure if you join the dots far enough, if you go back far enough, that maybe you can connect all of those things. Why is Ireland particularly good at keeping those records and making your job a little bit easier than it might be in other places?
In some respects, it can be harder because while we do have some great collections online and great institutions making that stuff available, a lot of that is in response to the Big Four Courts fire in 1922 at the start of the Irish Civil War. There was a lot of material lost in that. So, in some respects, Irish genealogy can have a reputation for actually being difficult in comparison to, say, researching in the UK or even in the States. But I think part of it is because we have this fact that people tended not to move around that much. Can sometimes make it easier. If you find a family on the 1901 census, it's quite reasonable to assume that the family would have been there going back generations. So once you kind of, you locate where the people were from, typically you can work backwards. And while occasionally there might be some movement, the vast majority, because we were so tied to the land. And that ends up resulting in land records and being kind of a major resource in genealogy.
Yeah, so land is your friend when it comes to this thing in a way.
Yeah, because land mattered so much to people, who, if you look back, say, at land records from around the 1850s, just after the famine, they'll usually have the name of the landlord. And then from there, maybe you can say, okay, well, are there any surviving records belonging to this landlord? And you might find like rental rules or something like that, which then say, this tenant has a lease of so many years. So once you can place them, you can then start looking at parish records and anything else local which might survive.
As time goes on and you're spending more and more time in this profession, does it get more interesting as time goes on?
I think it does. I think it's always interesting. Certainly, there's more and more sources becoming available. You get more collections that are released. You have more people building, kind of bringing various types of records together and, building them into databases, which then anyone can access. And I even find that sometimes, some of the requests I get from people, there's always something surprising that even when I might have two projects in roughly the same area, it'll always end up being completely different. Like, recently I had a lady living locally who asked me to do some research on her ancestors who were mainly from living around the South Parish area. And I discovered that I think it was her great-grandfather had died after being run over by a bull in the middle of Cork, in the middle of the city. That's, according to the newspapers, that the bull had, I'm not sure if they were loading it onto a train or taking it off a train, but the bull basically got free, ran through the city, ended up on the Coal Quay, where this unfortunate gentleman was just gotten its way.
Wrong place, wrong time.
Wrong place, wrong time. And I think he was actually, ironically, I think he was actually a cattle dealer by profession.
Oh, Jesus.
So, sometimes you just find these.
I'd say there were a lot of, well, not so funny, but I'm sure there were a few jokes told about that story in the pub.
Quite possibly, yeah. So again, it's like that, you never know what you're going to find. And also, I find that sometimes the opportunities come along to take on other projects, because after working the Triskel, I ended up with the Cork Folklore Project in the north side for a few years. And so much of history in Ireland revolves around that sort of, that's oral storytelling around memory. And I thought, this would be obviously a great benefit to the genealogy as well. And certainly I found that opened up a whole kind of new perspective for me, because often you find this, it's only when you actually sit down with someone and you start listening to them and you start asking them questions that you get, it kind of open up new areas that, you'd sit down with someone who, you might be, asking them to talk about, their career working in a certain business. And just by chance, you might say, my grandfather worked as a postmaster in Cove and he was one of the last people to set foot on the Titanic. It ties back into the genealogy then, that you never know what stories you'll uncover.
And everyone has a story, don't they?
Everyone has a story. And, I'm always looking for new areas to research. And I've gotten to know a lot of those working in Nannernagle Place over the years.
Yeah, and I've done a lot of work there as well.
Yeah, I know you've done a lot of stuff with them. And, I was doing something on, as part of Heritage Week a few years back, I wanted to do a walking tour of Douglas Street, but basing it on genealogical records. Sort of as a way of, finding out more about who lived there, what did they do, and stuff like that. And I went into got in contact with the South Presentation Archivist, Sister Rosari. I was like, what records would she have on? Because I know, the school was there. Obviously, they'd have a lot of records on the children who lived in the South Parish and would have attended school there, and got chatting to her. And a few years back, I ended up doing a second master's in University of Limerick in public history. And as part of that, I did a work placement with Nannernagle Place, because my research was all about how oral histories are used in different situations, particularly museums. And of course, Nannernagle Place seemed like the perfect case study for that. And as part of the placement, I was looking, we were encouraged to take on some sort of project. So they had recently come across this map of the burials. And I was, has anyone actually done any research into this? Obviously, the sisters themselves would have their own memories of who, many of the burials were. But of course, there have been Presentation Sisters and Ursulines being buried there since the time of Nannernagle herself. So obviously nobody's going to know exactly who all of these names were. So I started spending a lot of time in the presentation archives, doing research on that, and also looking at what would be the typical genealogical sources. So, okay, well, how do I trace this woman who was probably born under a different name than the one she would have taken on when she entered when she actually took on vows? And so I found, that ended up being a really interesting project. And as far as I know, they've started incorporating some of that information into their tours. And hopefully down the line, if they ever get the funding, they might actually be able to, turn that into something bigger.
At times it must be like mining for gold.
It is, because again, you never know what sort of stories you will come across. Like even when researching nuns, those of us, like I'd be just old enough to have had, say, nuns teaching for like junior infants, something like that. And I'm sure you would have had a few nuns teaching you when you were in school. And so we build up this stereotype of them in our heads. And we also had, as soon as they entered the convent, that was it. They also became sort of old women overnight. But you do find that they had so many surprising stories.
Yeah, and they are also so different.
They are. Oh, like each of them had, some of them were pioneers in like teaching lace making or in like specific subjects, or even just, you see their personalities will come through in some of the records.
It's amazing. And you mentioned the lace making specifically. And we think, oh, that's lovely. They're all doing this craft. But in particular, there was a huge lace making industry around Youghal. And I think at the time, they were really training their students to have a very practical skill that would earn money for their families. Because lace was a really precious item and it was in huge demand. So, it was more than, lovely lace making. It was one of the subjects they taught effectively for that very practical reason of families surviving. The most unusual request you would have got from one of these Yanks or whoever?
You do get so many. I guess sometimes it's someone looking for a connection to somebody famous, like someone who's, determined to find a link to Michael Collins or someone famous like that. And then you end up telling them, well, I'd love to be able to help you out. So the records for that parish only start on this date. Your family are showing up like the other side of the county at that time. So maybe there is a connection, but like it involves going way, way back. And I get a lot of requests for people trying to get Irish citizenship. And usually, at least citizenship laws in Ireland are relatively straightforward. You have to have had a grandparent who was born in Ireland. And sometimes that can cause confusion because you get a few of those in, say, like, particularly the US, who maybe they got citizenship in, like, Italy or Germany or something like that, where it's different. And they think, well, I have this, Irish 2 times great-grandparent. Surely that can be enough for me to get an Irish passport. You end up having to explain that just because you have Irish, you can prove that you have Irish heritage, or you have a DNA test which says you're 30% Irish or something like that. But it doesn't entitle you to the Irish citizenship.
Okay, so there's a very practical dimension to the work.
Yeah.
Might there be an inheritance dimension to it? Do you get that a little bit?
Sometimes, but when it comes to queries like that, there are genealogists in Ireland who specialise in probate. And certainly with stuff like that, Like, if someone asks me, oh, there's a copy of my, great uncle's will in the National Archives or in, say, Cork Archives here locally, would you be able to go in, take a few photos of it, and send the information on to me? Because, we've heard all these stories about, who inherited what, and we just want to, find out what was going on. So, stuff like that is usually straightforward. But for someone, say, who contacts me saying, well, I believe I'm related to such a person, I want to make a claim on their estate, can you help me? And I would say, what, you need to talk to somebody who specializes in this, because there are a lot of complicated legal issues around probate in Ireland. Because what tends to happen is that, say, someone might have been Irish, but maybe they died in, say, somewhere like London, and that's where the probate is filed. And then suddenly it gets into a lot of complicated issues about, like probate laws in the UK are different to those in Ireland. So, you need someone who can navigate all of that.
What's been your most satisfying case? Besides the poor bull.
The poor bull. It is hard to say. I mean, there have been situations where I've helped someone who had been adopted find out more information about their birth parents. There was also one of a relatively early project I did not long after it started, where I had a gentleman and I helped him discover that his great-grandfather had actually been the MP for Kinsale around about the mid-1800s, around the time of when Parnell was in charge of the Home Rule Party. So that way, that one was satisfying because it was my first experience of looking into, say, like some online UK records for like parliamentary records and stuff like that, and also being able to request a will from the UK and so, understanding how that was structured. So I think, all of them will tend to be satisfying in one way or the other.
You mentioned some of those other sites, like that Ancestry one, and are they the crew that do the DNA tests, or are they the crew that do
A lot of them, DNA testing has become a massive business now, and there are a lot of sites that offer it. Most of what the sites that offer it would be like the fairly standard consumer DNA kits, which basically, kind of goes back about 7 generations with accuracy, and will give you this percentage on, you're such a percentage Irish, such a percentage, Northern European, whatever. And that's what a lot of people, especially the Americans, tend to buy them for. But where they can be really useful is that, it's like, if you were to do one of these home DNA tests now, you'd probably end up getting a few like third cousins off in the US. And some of them, the names you might recognize. You might say, I remember such a person, like visited, back visiting Ireland when I was younger, or something like that. Or maybe they could be a complete mystery to you. And you end up sort of, looking at their online tree and you think, okay, well, how do we connect? And you go through it and you say, okay, well, you know what? They're showing up as their great-great-grandfather was a Canty. He's showing up as being from North Cork. This is probably where the connection is. So certainly, DNA, like Ancestry, are probably the biggest website in terms of like the business of genealogy. They'd have so many of the records. They have their own in-house professional genealogists. Like as a company, they're always looking for a new angle. Like they've even started, doing ancestral home visits for people. They're organizing, they've set up like their own genealogy cruises. They do almost everything. But there are a lot of other like similar websites. And the thing is, like, each of them will have different records. There will be some overlap, but so you'll find yourself sort of working across. I say one of the skills you pick up is how to use different databases and different websites. So, like, if you're looking at the like a US census or something like that, I might check on Ancestry first, and then maybe I'll check on one of the other websites just to make sure that there's no errors or anything like that.
Do you trust them, or is there a lot of spoof involved, do you think?
No, in fairness, I think the majority of these websites do their best to be accurate with their collections.
Okay.
Now, again, there will always be, there's always going to be a possibility of an error, like someone might have transcribed something wrong, because, it's not always easy to read the handwriting. So, I would trust them. But at the same time, my background as a historian has told me, always double check. So, for example, like you might find that where Ancestry is Irish records, the person who transcribed it might not have been familiar with Irish place names. So the handwriting might have been hard to read. So they might have gone, okay, well, this is what it looks like. So when I look at it, I might say, well, that doesn't seem correct. But what I do is I'd go to one of the place name databases websites we have here in Ireland. Look, I'd say, okay, well, you know what, this is the closest match. This seems to be in the correct area. So now as I know the townland, I know where they were, I can, chances are this is probably where they originated, and this is where I can actually start searching within that area. So mostly these websites are correct. But local knowledge is still important, because one of the things I would tell people to be careful of with any of the big genealogy websites is that their focus is on acquiring collections and being able to tell their subscribers, this month we added so many 1,000 pages of records from such an area. And of course, they'll say, it covers the dates like 1750 to 1920. But what they might not necessarily tell you is that there's a gap from 1850 to 1900. Or, something like that. Because again, their focus is on getting you to subscribe.
Of course.
Or if you have, like, say, you've set up, most of us would probably have some sort of online family tree on one of these websites, and you'll often get, will send you hints. And the danger can be is that sometimes people follow these hints blindly without checking them. So, for example, sometimes I'll have something saying, we have this record matching your great-grandfather, Jim Ryan, and we have him in New York in 1900. I'll be able to look at this and go, well, there's absolutely no way that he was in New York at that time, because I have him on the 1901 census. I have all the records of his children being born, and a farmer from South Tipperary wasn't going to get up and just go on a holiday.
On a day trip.
On a day trip. It's not like nowadays where we can say, it wasn't like, say, the days of the Celtic Tiger where people would fly in for like, a long weekend shopping in Manhattan or something else. Like these journeys at this time, typically they tended to be one way. The majority of people who went off out to the States tended to stay there. So, as I said, people can sometimes get tripped up by these hints and by, I guess now, kind of applying a modern mindset to people who lived over 100 years ago. So, but like as I said, though, with Ireland, though, we are fortunate that there are a lot of great free resources available online. As I mentioned, I'd always, when people are starting out in their family history, I'd always say to them, well, okay, the first thing you should do after you've sort of, spoken to some of your own relatives and gotten all your information together is start with the 1911 census records. Because the majority of us will probably know at least who our grandparents and great-grandparents were. So if you can at least place them on that gives you a solid starting point.
It's like an anchor.
It's an anchor, and you can take, at least with, the 1911 census, say, okay, well, my great-grandmother, she's 45 in 1911, which means she was probably born in, whatever year. And, that then allows you to say, okay, well, then I can actually look for the birth record, or I can say, okay, well, their eldest child is 22 in 1911. So, okay, well, they probably married just before he was born. So again, all of that gives you, as I said, that gives you an anchor. And from there, you can kind of you can work outwards.
Can you talk to me about the family tree or the family crest? Something that I think, maybe I'm wrong now, but I think we used to be more obsessed about those. And to a lot of houses you go in and you see the wooden plaque and the whole lot. We've forgotten about that, have we, David, a little bit?
I think part of the issue is like the family crest was always more of a bit of a tourist gimmick, because the thing is like the crest was something that was commissioned for a specific branch of the family. So, for example, like, my house, like we have Orion crest, but that would have been for a certain Orion family who had property up in North Tip. I can't remember which particular branch it was now. And then you could have had another branch of the family who had a completely different crest. So, but heraldry, it's not something I think people are as interested in anymore. Maybe that's because, at least for Irish people, maybe the actual family tree has taken over, that we can find more real information. But anytime I go into tourist shops, I'll always see plenty of these, plaques or coasters or all of that with, the, crests for various families.
Because in a marketing context, you'd hear people talking about your brand, and then suddenly you say, David, you need to mind your personal brand.
Yeah.
And I was, for God's sake, why does an individual have to be a brand? And I used to always spin this story about, well, branding actually started off with individuals in the first place, with things like your family crest. And I used to always talk about, if you're going to battle, if the Canties are fighting the Ryans, well, you probably needed colours on your shields to distinguish between one gang and the other, to make sure you're not shooting the wrong people. And so that was your coat of arms, which was something to protect yourself, and all of those colours. And I had come to understand that each of those colours was very significant, and all the symbols on them were even more significant. Is that a bit of hogwash, or is there some truth in it?
There is some truth in that. Like Ireland, we still have there's still a heraldry office located in the National Archives. So, heraldry, it's still something that people will research, and there was a lot of significance to the symbolism, because, of course, in a time when people didn't necessarily have a lot of literacy, the visuals were very important for telling people who you were and why you were important. And even like if you go into some older churches, like for example, if you went into St. Finbarr's Cathedral here in the city, you also like on alongside the wall, you see a lot of crests for various families who were significant patrons for the cathedral.
Okay. I did a quick little bit of research on you, and I had one or two little questions. What in the name of God is an invigilator?
Invigilator.
Invigilator, sorry.
It's an exam supervisor. So, and at times when things are relatively slow in genealogy, I usually take on a bit of side work in UCC, helping with exam invigilation supervision. So, like, we're the people who, when we're doing, when you're sitting there, you're doing your exam, we're the ones who are walking up and down the hall, making sure no one is cocking off somebody else. You have, enough answer books, or if somebody is feeling ill and needs to go outside or anything like that. I suppose we're basically there just to make sure that the exams run smoothly for all the students involved.
Okay. And I thought that might have been some technical genealogy term or a branch of it. So you have to...
First with genealogy, it has... One of the associations involved with is the Association of Professional Genealogists, which is primarily US-based, but we have quite a lot of members internationally now, particularly here in Ireland and the UK. And you do find there are a lot of people now who found a specific niche within genealogy that they're able to pursue. You'll find some who focus maybe more on military research. It's a big thing in the UK and US, researching, doing military repatriation research. You have some who really focus on DNA, really kind of, they'd be if you're ever curious about the science behind this, and what all of if you do the test, you see all of these little numbers beside each match, and okay, what does all of this mean and all that. So they really specialize in that. And then there's others who are maybe more acidic, maybe do more in the way of probate research, or would work on helping people with the citizenship cases, because I said Ireland at least is relatively straightforward. But from friends I know who do a lot of stuff on, say, Italian and German citizenship, it can be very, very complicated. It's not just a case of showing up with your ancestors' birth certificates. You really need to provide a lot of other stuff alongside it. So it's, as a field, it's not just, I'm going to help someone work on their family tree. There are a lot of very, very complicated areas involved in it. So at least for me, I said, long ago that, I'm happy enough with focusing on just, local Irish research. I found my niche here in Cork. I'm happy with that. If someone does contact me saying, well, one half of the family was from Cork, the other half were from Galway, then I say, I'm happy enough at least to do both. But if you decide that, you really want to go more in depth on the Galway side at one point, then, here's the name of either a genealogist there, maybe just a local historian who could really help you learn more.
I have a blog, Greg County Fusion, and the way you can look at your traffic.
Yeah.
And if you look at the stats, it'll tell you the keywords that brought people onto your site and all that kind of thing. One time, a number of years back, I started seeing a load of this Greg County RAP, and that was the traffic coming onto my site. And I did a little Mr. Google, and Greg County RAP brought me to some poor black kid in the States who tragically died at the age of 21, I think it was. Is there a chance if I went searching that we will be connected?
Quite possibly, because I think you were saying your own Canties being from North Cork, and most of my own family were from pretty much, the Cork, Tipperary border area. And, again, if you go back far enough, everyone is related, especially in a country like Ireland that had such a small population until relatively recently. So I think, you would find that, once you go back far enough, we are all connected, although proving it is the tricky part.
Yeah, so I won't give you that task.
Yeah, it's...
Now, I did another search and I came across this poor lad who was in prison in the States. And I thought it'd be a very interesting thing to reach out to him. Deirdre, the very wise Deirdre said, probably not.
Yeah.
You'd never know who'd turn up at your doorstep someday saying, I'm related to you. What's happiness to you, David?
Happiness. That can be a tricky one to pin down someone, but I think for me, it's just, being able to explore, especially when I'm surrounded by history. I'm one of these people. When I go abroad, I'll probably make straight for like the nearest museum or the nearest historic building.
And if you're a striker playing with Liverpool and you've just put the ball in the back of the net and it gives you huge satisfaction, what's the equivalent for you?
For me, I think it's untangling someone's family tree. Like when someone comes to me and they don't know that much, that may be, for reasons of adoption or just, like parents dying young or something like that. I'll actually be able to say to them, yes, this is your family. These are your people. This is some context on them. This is their story, I guess. This is, how they fit into the wider tapestry.
It must be very exciting presenting those results to someone.
It is. And it's okay. Once or twice I've had queries where maybe someone had half siblings in Ireland that they were vaguely aware of, and maybe at least helping them to find out who they were. Stuff like that can be very, very satisfying.
Like scoring a goal.
I think so. I was never great at sport, so.
Well, it doesn't matter. It's a goal. It's a goal. It's a goal that's
True,
just a little bit different. My very last question for you: what's the choice that you made in your life that brought the biggest change?
I think it was actually when about a decade or so ago, I took a chance on applying to speak at a genealogy conference in the States. I was relatively new to doing talks and stuff at the time. I thought, there's no chance in hell I'll be accepted. But through that, I actually got to know so many other people working in the field. I made a lot of friends, people I still, would be in contact with today. And it really opened up more opportunities for me. And I was raised, there's a big interest in people actually having someone talk to them about how to do their Irish family tree.
And I'm sure at the time when you were asked, you were probably petrified at the idea, were you?
Oh, I was, because again, this was my first time doing something like that internationally. I wasn't sure, there's always that bit of imposter syndrome in the back of your head when you're asked to do something like that.
Amazing. There's a lesson in that for all of us, isn't there?
No, I think, it's, always be willing to take a chance.
Yeah. Fantastic. David, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed the conversation about a very, very interesting topic. Thank you so much. We'll chat to you again. Take it easy.
Yeah. All the best, Greg.
Yeah,
Cheers.
take
Bye.
it easy. Thank you for listening to the Win Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.